Lastly, we're going to talk about one objection to the problem of evil that is a little bit more complicated. We're not going to spend a huge amount of time on it, but we're going to devote this whole video to it. The solution goes by the name of skeptical theism. Now, it's a little bit more complicated from the get-go because it is not an objection to a premise. So if we go back and we look at the formulation of the problem of evil, which we have here, we considered lots of objections to one, and these went by way of attempts to explain why God would allow an evil to exist in the world, or some evil. And we even looked at, very briefly, one objection to two, a claim that there is no evil in the world, it's all an illusion. But this last objection is really not an objection directly to either premise. I would characterize it, without having to rewrite the argument to make it more complicated, I would characterize it as an objection to the support for premise one. So as we've talked about, you have an argument and the premises support the conclusion. And you can give objections to those premises, directly to those premises. Like, for example, with one, you just need to find a case where it looks like God could exist even though he wouldn't eliminate all evil. If you wanted to find a counterexample to two, you would just find a case where, or you would try to show that it wouldn't really be a counterexample so much as an objection that evil does not actually exist. And you'd have to give some sort of argument that evil does not exist. So you're giving an argument for the opposite of what the premise says. But another way to attack an argument is to say that even though this is a valid argument, if the premises were true, the conclusion would be true. I don't have any evidence directly against a premise, but I can give you an objection to the support for a premise. So this is to undermine the support for a premise. The premises support the conclusion, but you also have support for the premises. Why should I believe one? And then I'll give you an argument that ultimately would end with one as the conclusion, and we would have further premises supporting one. We're not going to draw all that out. We're just going to talk about the support for one without doing it in all the argument style. But you could say, well, look, there is no support for one. And that's what we're going to consider here. You could do it for any premise, that there's just no, you could claim, instead of arguing directly against that premise, you could claim that there is no support for that premise. And that's what we're going to look at here under the name of skeptical theism. So what skeptical theism claims, basically, it's a little more complicated than this when you get down into the weeds, but basically the claim is that we don't have any evidence for one. And the idea is that in order to have evidence for one, we'd have to have a case where we know that God would not allow that evil. And we would have to go through every single evil or every single apparent evil and say, God would not allow this. A good, all-powerful, omniscient God would not allow this. But that would require having the sort of knowledge that God would not have sufficient reason to allow it. A good, perfect, all-powerful God would not have sufficient reason to allow this evil. But what skeptical theists claim is we're not in a position epistemologically to have that knowledge. We are very finite creatures. We are not only finite in our cognitive capacities, but we're also deeply morally compromised creatures, right? We are misinformed about morality, about what's good and what's bad, and partially because we read our own preferences into it. We see things selfishly. We want to see what's good for us as good in general. We want to see what hurts us as bad in general, and sometimes that skews our moral vision, our vision of what's good and bad. We're prejudiced in that way. So not only are our cognitive capacities limited, we can't know everything, we don't have time to investigate everything, we can't consider all the evidence, there's just so much, right, that we don't know and don't have time or energy or even capacity to know. But we're also prejudiced in ways that skews our ability to see the truth, morally speaking. And so you might think creatures like that, even if God had a good reason to allow an evil, we wouldn't be able to see it, right? God is all-knowing and perfectly good. We only know a tiny, tiny proportion of what's out there to be known, and we're definitely very far from morally perfect, right? In many cases, we're deeply morally flawed. So why would we expect such creatures to be able to understand God's reasons for allowing evil? This is very different from the other objections that we've considered to the problem of evil, because what they've tried to do is essentially, at least objections to one, have tried to give reasons God could have for allowing evil. And what the skeptical theists are doing is saying, I'm not going to try to give you a reason that God has for allowing evil. But what I am telling you is that if he had them, we wouldn't know about them. So we can't count it as evidence against him having reasons to allow this evil that we don't see them. Right? So I'm going to present you a complicated sort of theoretical principle behind this argument. It's going to look complicated. We're going to talk through it, though. The basic premise, though, we need to be a little more subtle and when we get to the details, and that's why I'll put it up here in a complicated form. But the basic idea here is that, look, you don't have evidence for something if it would appear to you the same way, regardless of whether it was the case. Or to put it another way, you don't have evidence that something doesn't exist if it would look, let me say this. It doesn't constitute evidence against something that you don't see it if you wouldn't see it even if it did exist. Okay, so I'll give you one example, then we'll look at the principle. Here's an example. Suppose I said, I think I have evidence that electrons don't exist because I don't see them. I'm looking around. I've been looking around for the 31 years of my life. I've never seen an electron. So I think they don't exist. Why would I believe in them? I can't see them. Well, the obvious reply is, well, they're invisible to the naked eye. If they existed, you wouldn't see them. So why would you take not seeing them as evidence that they don't exist? So the idea behind this, to put it as a general claim, is, hey, not seeing something doesn't give you a reason not to believe in it if you wouldn't see it if it existed. So here's the principle. It appears that P only counts as evidence for P if it would not appear that P if P were not the case. That's a very complicated way of saying the same thing, right? So, but it's trying to get at the general universal nature of this principle. So it appearing to you that something is the case is really only evidence that it's the case on the assumption that if it weren't the case, it wouldn't seem to you that like it was the case, right? So let's think of a case. So I gave you a case where I perceived an absence of something and I said it doesn't exist. Now let's try to give the other case. It looks to me like something exists and I conclude on that basis that it exists even though I'm not justified in that, right? So suppose, let me give you a kind of a goofy example, but just to get the point across. Suppose that I'm sitting in front of this window right now. This is actually true. That's where this light is coming from. Now, suppose that somebody painted the window really well, like really realistically. And they even like backlit it so that the light was still coming through. And they painted it so that it looks just like it looks now to me, actually looking through the window. And it's, cloudy skies, something like that. So they paint it to look like it's the front yard of my house and the street and everything that I see out there. So now I say, and suppose that happened last night. So what we're seeing right now is actually a painting or a photograph or something like that. And now I think it's cloudy outside, which it is right now. Or so it seems to me to be cloudy outside. Is it seeming like it's cloudy to me through this window evidence that it's cloudy in this situation? You might say no, because in this situation, it might actually be cloudy outside, but it's going to look like it's cloudy to me regardless of whether it's cloudy. Maybe it is cloudy, so maybe I'm actually correct in saying it's cloudy outside, but I don't have good evidence for it because it's going to look cloudy to me even if it's not, because someone has painted cloudiness onto my window, right? So it looks like it's cloudy to me, and I conclude on that basis it's cloudy. But there's a big problem here, because even if it was sunny, it would look cloudy to me. Even if the sun was out and, little bunnies hopping across a yard and spring flowers popping up everywhere, it would look dreary and cloudy to me. So it's going to look the same either way. And so it's a weird thing to say that I have good evidence that it's cloudy outside. So that's sort of the principle behind this. You can only conclude something based on its appearance if it wouldn't appear that way if it weren't the case. And so similarly, in this case, we say, well, I don't see any reasons. It seems to me like God does not have a reason to allow the evils that I see in the world. Can we conclude on that basis that God does not have a reason to allow evil in the world? And the skeptical theists, relying on this principle, say, no, we can't make that conclusion. And here's why. Because of our cognitive limitations and our moral prejudices and biases, we would not be able to see God's reasons for allowing evil, even if they did exist. So relying on this principle, we cannot conclude just based on the appearance that they're not there. We can't conclude that they're not actually there, right? We cannot conclude that unless we had reason to think that we would see them if they were there, right? So it's the exact same structure of the argument with electrons. I can't conclude that electrons don't exist just because I don't see them, because if they are there, I won't see them. I cannot conclude that God doesn't have reason to allow evil, because if he did, I wouldn't see it. So that is the skeptical theist argument. It's an argument not directly against one, but it's the argument that we don't have evidence, we don't have a good argument for one. So let's finish up talking about some of the problems, well, really just one of the problems that people have had with this sort of argument. And the argument is basically that, well, if you were really in order to get this argument working, you have to say essentially that we don't really have any moral knowledge, right? Because if you're going to say that when you look at the Holodomor and you're so skeptical about our ability to understand the reasons for its happening that we can't even say whether there's a good reason for it to happen, then you're basically committed to the claim that we just don't understand anything about our moral world, right? We don't even know if the Holodomor was justified. How can we know whether someone stealing fruit from the fruit stand was wrong? How can we punish them if we don't know that it was wrong? We basically are committed to claiming that we don't have any moral knowledge. That is the objection to skeptical theism. It commits you to saying that we actually really don't know much about what's right and wrong, about what's justified and unjustified. I'm not going to continue that debate here. That is just one of the biggest objections to skeptical theism. And skeptical theists need to either say, well, that's okay. We just don't know a lot, morally speaking. We're very deeply morally flawed. So should we expect to know a lot? I can't know whether what anybody does is right or wrong. Or they can say, no, it's different. I can't know God's reasons for allowing evil, but I can know certain mundane facts about good and bad and right and wrong in the actual world when they're committed by humans. Now, how can they make that complaint or that comparison or that disanalogy really? How can they draw that difference between the two cases? I'm going to leave y'all to think about that. And if you think that you can draw that distinction and say, well, I'm actually on the skeptical theist side here. I think we can't know God's reasons for allowing evil, but we can know that stealing is wrong or that murder is wrong, that there wasn't a good reason for the person to do that. Then leave it in the comments. All right. Thanks, y'all.